I'm Emma Stratton, and this is Better Messaging. If you want to stop second-guessing yourself and start writing better messaging today, you're in the right place. A couple times a year, I run a messaging training cohort with marketers from all sorts of different companies. They come together and join me for a month-long training experience. We do a lot of fun stuff like workshopping, and of course, I teach a lot of content. But one part that I really love about the messaging training cohort is that you get an individual one-on-one feedback session with me that you can use for whatever purpose you want. So folks will often bring an asset or something they're working on. So maybe messaging, brand voice guidelines, launch materials, all sorts of things. But recently, a marketer brought a pretty interesting and fun challenge to me. She came to me and wanted advice about naming a new product. So her company had a new product that they were launching and they were super excited about, and they couldn't really decide on a name. So she showed me some of the contenders for the name, and quite frankly, I can't remember any of the names. And I think this happens a lot with product names and names in tech. They're kind of odd and hard to remember. So I can't remember the names that she shared with me, but I do remember that they were kind of opaque names that didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time. So I asked her if this product was the first product that they were naming, and she kind of shook her head and said, "Oh, I wish. Let me show you all of our product names." And she went and brought up her company website and pulled the drop-down tab of all the different products that this company offered. And sure enough, each product had its own unique and special name. Again, I can't remember any of these names. They were not memorable, and it's also hard to remember names, but there was maybe, I would say, 10 different names of different products all on this drop down. And I looked at that situation and I thought, oh boy, you have a naming debt situation here. So naming debt. Okay, we've heard about technical debt. We know what that is, but there is a thing called naming debt. And I see this quite a lot, especially with companies who have been around for a few years, who are growing, they found success, they're launching products. And every time they launch a product, they give it its own name, almost as if it's a new baby, right? A new baby that deserves its own identity. They're giving each product a name, and that ends up creating a lot of difficulties for the marketing team. So today I want to talk about my recommendation for naming your products. Now, naming is not technically part of messaging. It is adjacent. It is about words. But I have a thing for naming because in a past life, I could have been a professional namer. I was kind of going down that track, and I almost accepted a job as a professional namer at a naming agency. You probably are like, what? There's a professional namer? Yes, it is a thing. And I had done quite a bit of naming previously to when I started Punchy. I did a lot of naming when I worked at a branding agency. So back in the day, I used to partner with clients like Procter & Gamble, Colgate Palmolive, and I would come up with names for new products. I think the only name that actually got through was a name for a moist toilet paper. I think we called them washlets. That was part of my work. But I spent a lot of time working on naming new products, and I got into a couple situations where I was helping to rename companies. And I gotta tell you, naming is hard. Okay, naming is hard. I think it's a dark art in and of itself. It is not easy to do. And if you've ever tried to name something, I think you know what I'm talking about. Naming is hard for a couple reasons. One of the reasons it's really hard is that it's super subjective, right? People have all kinds of associations linked to certain names. And I remember working with a namer in the past who called this grandma's cat syndrome. It's like you throw out a potential name and someone's like, oh, my grandmother's cat had that name. Or, oh, I had an ex-boyfriend whose friend was that name, so I don't like that name. People just coming up with memories and associations that they've tacked onto that name and why they don't like it. So that's something that comes up a lot with naming. It's very emotional. It's very subjective, very opinionated. And people also get their emotions attached to it. I remember once I was working on renaming a SaaS company, actually, and did it with the leadership team. I was running a whole naming workshop, and one of the leaders was holding on to this name. And I actually, again, I can't remember the name, but it was something Greek. Like it had a classical Greek edge to it. It was not at all aligned with this kind of hot new startup. And he was holding on to this name almost like a precious baby and wouldn't let it go throughout the whole naming workshop and insisted that it was on the short list. And I've seen this happen time and time again with naming. It is just very, very hard to get a bunch of people to agree on one name. And the bigger and more important the thing is that you're naming, the harder it is to actually do. So now that we've established that naming is super, super hard, now I want to talk about what you should think about when it comes to naming your own product. So I get it. You've got this new product and you're so excited about it. Also, internally, you have probably named this product. You refer it to a certain way and you've gotten used to it. It has an identity and a life to you. Should you give that product a name and go to market with it and market it with that name? Well, I always recommend no in most cases, okay? In most cases, I believe that it's a lot more sensible and easy on your buyer to go for a more straightforward descriptive name. The type of name that kind of gives you a sense of what the product is rather than a made up branded name that is hard to understand or may not actually have anything to do with the product itself. Because here's the thing about names. A name doesn't really mean anything until you fill meaning into it. Imagine it like an empty cup, right? It's just a cup, but you've got to fill it with meaning for it to be meaningful. You know, actually, I don't know if that cup metaphor made sense. It made sense in my mind. But just remember that a name has to be filled with meaning and association. In the beginning, a name is just a word. It doesn't really mean a lot or do a lot. It doesn't make people feel a certain way or think that much. People have to start connecting it to a product and then they build their own association. So in the beginning, a name is just a name. Now, when you come up with a branded name that kind of doesn't have anything to do with what the product is, that is something that needs to be filled with meaning. It is another thing that a buyer has to kind of figure out. In addition to what is your product and why should I care about your product, first they have to get a sense of what it is from the name. So when you create a name, it's another thing that you have to explain, that you have to get people to understand on top of what the product already is. And my personal kind of philosophy is to make things as easy as possible on the buyer. Make it easy for them to understand and grasp what your product is. Help them shop your site easily and don't make it hard. When you pull down a drop down that has all sorts of different kind of wacky product names, you're kind of thinking, what am I looking at here? As opposed to when you have more descriptive names, you start to sort of set the stage for the different things that your products can actually do. So I recommend going descriptive. So let me give you an example of descriptive versus branded names in an approach, and you can kind of see the difference between the two. Because where a branded name gets complicated is when you have many products with different names. That's when things start to get ungainly and a bit complex, and then it becomes hard for people to understand how these products work together and what they actually cover. So let's do a made-up example. And I'm going to pretend we're talking about a data insights company named Hydro. Hey, I like that name, Hydro. And I want to give you an example of taking two different approaches. So Hydro has 3 different products. And if I were going descriptive and trying to be very true to what these products are, these are my 3 product names being very descriptive for Hydro. One is segments. The second is charts, and the third is playbooks, right? They're one word, very clear. I kind of have an understanding of what each thing is about, right? Segments, charts, and playbooks. Now, if I wanted to go branded and come up with my own name for each one of those, Instead of segments, I might call that user view. That's kind of related to understanding my customer segments, sort of, right? Instead of charts, I'm going to say something like easy charts, okay? Easy charts. See what I did there? And instead of playbooks, I'm going to go for power play because that sounds exciting and it kind of has one of the words in it. So now, instead of segments, charts, and playbooks, I have got user view, easy charts, and power play. Not as clear, is it? Right? When I say segments, charts, playbooks, you have a sense of what these products can do. Whereas user view, easy charts, power play, it is not as clear. You're going to have to really dive into those pages and start to figure out, okay, what are these products? So to me, that's a missed opportunity. So when we're talking about clarity, that descriptive product name is really helpful. But now I want to get to that kind of marketing reality. I want to bring in the company name because Hydro is the company. And it's the larger brand with more equity or should have more equity than the products. So if we were to tack on Hydro in front of the product name, let's see what that looks like. So if I do it with a descriptive way, it's not so bad, right? We got Hydro segments, Hydro charts, and Hydro playbooks. Not bad. 2 words. I get what each thing is, and it links back to Hydro. Now, if I do the same thing with the branded names, it gets a little bit more complicated. I've got Hydro user view, Hydro easy charts, Hydro power play. Now it's kind of like, all right, what does that mean? So I got Hydro in front and it's not super clear and it's a bit of a word salad. And there's just really not so much cohesion there. It just seems a bit random. Sure, Hydro is repeated, but user view, easy charts, power play, they all have slightly different vibes and they don't really fit together like a family. And this is what happens when you go for a branded name approach. Every time a new product comes, you give it a new name. And it's like maybe there's not much of a strategy behind it or a naming strategy. Every name is a one-off. And so they're not really created with an understanding of how these names are going to fit together in a naming architecture. Now, naming architecture, that's something I learned all about back in my consumer branding days when I would work on products that would sit under the main brand name and how would they all work together. So brand architecture, naming conventions could be very important back then. And they're really important in tech now when we've got companies shipping so many products and new releases. And you want to come up with a strategy that not only works for today, but is also going to work for the future as you grow. Maybe you acquire new businesses or you release new products. You want to have a system where it still works no matter how much you grow. A scalable system, if you will. And this practice of one-off naming is not scalable. It's a bit random. And really, I've got proof to back up that this doesn't work super well because I've been hired 3 times in recent years to help a company backtrack from that decision to brand all of their product names. So companies that, again, got really excited about things they were launching and wanting to give them names and their own logos sometimes. And then they get to this point where the menu is just a mess under products and they need to clean it up and make it easier for buyers to navigate. So that is the data that I need to know that it's not really working to kind of go with the branded product names. So the 3 top reasons that I really recommend going this descriptive product naming. Number 1, it just makes it super easy for your buyers to kind of understand. They get an immediate sense of what the product is or what it's for. So right after reading the name, they're in the right ballpark. And this is helpful rather than a random name that leaves them guessing, that tells them nothing, and they have to keep searching for that understanding. Anytime we can make life easier for our buyer to understand what we do, you got to take it. So that's the first reason. The second is that it gives you the flexibility to make changes to names when you need to strategically, and it doesn't require like a massive rebrand. So as your product naturally evolves, or maybe as things get kind of decommissioned and new things come in, it's really easy to adjust and shift your naming convention when you're just going descriptive rather than throwing out brands and logos and things like that. So it gives you more flexibility. You can make changes and it's not a massive deal. And finally, this is probably one of the best reasons, descriptive names are actually quite easy to come up with. And if you know the product, well, you've got everything you need to be a good descriptive namer. You don't have to hire a fancy professional namer like I used to be, or pay lots of money to a branding agency to come up with a name, or go through the heartache of trying to come up with a branded name together as a group. It's actually pretty straightforward to just come up with a here's what this product does name. In fact, recently, one of these clients that I was working with on reverting back to a more descriptive naming convention, they were a group of guys that would be the first to say that they were not creative. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think we're all creative, but they would be quick to say that they were numbers guys and not creative. But they did a fantastic job of coming up with descriptive names for their products because they understood their product and what it did. And so they came up with the new naming convention quite easily. And I think that is the case in most cases. So if you're in a position right now where you're kind of wondering which way to go with your product names, I really, really recommend going descriptive. If I haven't convinced you by now, it just makes life easier for the buyer, but it also makes life easier for you in marketing and even adjusting to future changes and not feeling so confined to a certain name or brand or logo use. And if you are in a place where you have lots of product names and you're still not totally sold on going descriptive, why not try the exercise of thinking about how it might look if you did go descriptive instead? So it doesn't have to be what you do, but just see if you were going to go simple and go for a descriptive name, 1 to 2 words, tops, that really just straightforward explains what the product is or what it does, and just see how that looks and compare that to what you have now. And you might just be convinced to take a simpler approach. Names are a funny thing. I think one of my first clients that I ever worked with in tech had the situation where the company had a name and their platform had a different name. And it was something that had started in the very beginning and they just kept going with it. And it was very difficult to market 2 names, the company and the platform. And for many years, they struggled with that because when you have a product brand and a company brand, you're competing for that equity. When you have a branded product name, you're kind of stealing away some of that equity that could potentially be going to your company. So why not get all of that equity and connect it to your company rather than connecting it to a product? It will build your company brand. And I have also spoken to many customers at companies that have a product name and a company name, and pretty much every time they just call the product the company name anyway, and they don't remember the product name. So in short, I really recommend going descriptive, keeping it simple and clear, not worrying about the razzle dazzle, but instead going for clarity to really serve your buyers. That's really going to help them understand what your product can do for them and move them a step closer to buying. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Better Messaging. If you like what you heard, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep it punchy, my friend.